The scratch of quills against parchment echoed through Vatican corridors like death rattles. February 3rd, 1502. Three exhausted witnesses emerged from their shadowed posts, carrying documentation that would rewrite the rules of royal marriage forever. Behind them, in a bedchamber that reeked of sweat and political necessity, lay the evidence of the most methodically planned deflowering in Renaissance history. What crime against nature could justify such invasion of privacy? What political emergency demanded that a wedding night become a public performance, witnessed and documented like a military campaign? The heavy breathing from behind silk curtains wasn't passion, it was the sound of dynasties being forged. Those whispered confirmations between bride and groom weren't endearments, they were treaties signed in flesh instead of ink. And those witnesses? They weren't perverts. They were architects of a new world where bedroom performance determined battlefield victories. But here's what makes this story truly shocking. The bride had orchestrated every humiliating detail herself. Lucrezia Borgia, at 22, had transformed her own body into currency more valuable than any dowry. The question that would haunt European courts for centuries: how did wedding beds become political theaters where virgin brides became seasoned diplomats? To understand this sexual revolution, we must rewind to the moment when 100,000 gold ducats tumbled onto Vatican counting tables, and Lucrezia discovered her value wasn't in virtue or beauty, but in the calculated consummations that would cost her own blood. Listen, that sound echoing through papal chambers? 100,000 gold ducats cascading onto counting tables, like funeral bells for innocence. December 30th, 1501. Each coin rang with the weight of calculated desperation as Pope Alexander VI negotiated his daughter's value down to the last florin. Lucrezia Borgia stood perfectly still while her father bartered her body like livestock. She'd been here before, twice actually. Two previous marriages had taught her that Borgia women were currency in a game where survival meant controlling your own exchange rate. The Ferrara delegation sat across from the Pope, their demands specific and non-negotiable. They wanted more than gold. They wanted proof, irrefutable, witnessed proof, that this marriage would produce heirs worthy of the Este bloodline. But here's what the history books won't tell you. The most shocking demand wasn't written in any contract. Cardinal Ippolito d'Este leaned forward, his words weighted with implication that would echo through European bedchambers for generations. The consummation must be witnessed 3 times, verified beyond any shadow of doubt. The temperature in the chamber dropped. This wasn't standard protocol. Noble marriages often included witness verification, but the cardinal's tone suggested something unprecedented, something that would require not just observation, but clinical documentation of every thrust, every gasp, every drop of blood. Lucrezia kept her expression neutral, a skill perfected through years of Vatican survival. But inside, she was calculating. Her first marriage had ended with her husband claiming impotence rather than admit political defeat. Her second had ended with her husband's blood-painting Vatican stones. Now this third negotiation carried different energy. What drove the Este family to such extreme demands? What had happened to make them distrust Borgia promises so completely that they needed to watch the consummation happen? The scream still echoed through Vatican corridors 3 years later. August 18th, 1500. Alfonso of Aragon's final breath rattled through marble halls as Lucrezia knelt in his blood, her tears mixing with the crimson evidence of Borgia politics. Her second husband had been murdered while she prayed. The official story claimed bandits, but Rome laughed at the lie. Everyone knew Cesare Borgia had demanded Alfonso's death, and Lucrezia's grief couldn't wash away the truth. But we need to understand what created such a survivor. 1493. Lucrezia's first marriage to Giovanni Sforza had started with traditional pageantry. 13 years old, draped in cloth of gold, she'd played the virgin bride perfectly. The wedding night proceeded according to tradition. Witnesses stationed, consummation confirmed, contract sealed. For 4 years, she'd performed the role of dutiful wife, while her husband slowly realized he'd married into a viper's nest. The dissolution became Rome's favorite scandal when Giovanni, rather than admit political defeat, declared himself impotent in public tribunals. He swore that despite 4 years of marriage, he'd never successfully bedded his wife. The humiliation was calculated. Better to claim sexual failure than acknowledge Borgia manipulation. But here's what the gossips missed. Lucrezia had orchestrated every detail. She'd provided witnesses who swore to her intact virginity. She'd maintained perfect composure while her husband destroyed his reputation. She'd learned that survival meant weaponizing shame. Between these marriages, Lucrezia had given birth to a mysterious child, the infans Romanus, whose parentage sparked rumors still poisoning historical records. Some whispered the father was her brother Cesare, others claimed Pope Alexander himself. So when the marriage negotiators sat down in December 1501, they weren't acquiring some innocent maiden. They were negotiating with damaged goods, a woman who'd survived what would have destroyed others. But sometimes damage creates value. The question burning through those negotiations: could a woman who'd watched love die in Vatican chambers perform any wedding night ritual without flinching? And more importantly, what was she planning that they couldn't see coming? The roar of forge fires defined Alfonso d'Este long before wedding contracts entered his world. In Ferrara's armories, the Duke's heir worked molten metal with his own hands. Scandalous for nobility, revolutionary for a future sovereign. But Alfonso found truth in the forge that escaped him at court. Iron didn't lie. Steel didn't scheme. When heated white-hot and hammered into shape, metal became exactly what you made it. No politics, just power shaped by will. Born in 1476, Alfonso grew up understanding he was the spare heir thrust into succession he'd never wanted. His obsession with artillery wasn't mere hobby. Alfonso d'Este would become Renaissance Italy's premier military engineer, designing cannons that could shatter walls previously thought impregnable. But in December 1501, his family demanded he apply that same practical intelligence to marriage, specifically marriage to the Pope's notorious daughter. The Este family's initial revulsion was spectacular. They traced their lineage back to Charlemagne, ruled Ferrara when Rome was still fighting over pig markets. Now they were expected to welcome Lucrezia Borgia, the thrice-married, scandal-drenched daughter of a corrupt pope whose name was synonymous with poison and perversion. Here's what set Alfonso apart from typical Renaissance princes. He didn't pretend romance or devise elaborate schemes. He simply accepted. When his family presented the marriage contract, he studied it like artillery specifications. When they explained the unusual consummation requirements, he nodded as if they'd described bronze casting temperatures. Alfonso had been married before, a brief, disastrous union annulled on grounds of non-consummation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. His first wife had claimed he'd never bedded her. Now his second wife would require triple proof of his vigor. But Alfonso approached this challenge like any engineering problem. What was required? Evidence of consummation. How was evidence created? Through witnessed performance. His practical mind settled on three: the number of completion, of certainty beyond doubt. The same methodical patience that perfected cannon design would be applied to wedding night performance. Where other grooms might have felt humiliation, Alfonso saw only specifications to meet. But there was something else driving his acceptance, something his family couldn't see. The letters between Rome and Ferrara reveal Alfonso's growing involvement in planning not just the financial details, but the intimate mechanics of their union. What was he calculating that went beyond mere political necessity? What did this master of warfare understand about the woman he was about to marry? The sudden intake of breath when their eyes first met changed everything. January 30th, 1502. The Bentivoglio Palace in Bologna had been chosen as neutral ground for the pre-wedding meeting. Just 3 days before their public ceremony demanded they actually see each other. Lucrezia arrived dressed strategically, not the cloth of gold that screamed Borgia wealth, but deep burgundy velvet suggesting maturity, experience, survival. She positioned herself beside a window where winter light would catch the gold in her hair, still her best feature at 22. Alfonso entered with characteristic directness. No flourished bow, no pretty speeches. He simply walked in, looked at her, and stopped. For 3 heartbeats, neither moved. Then Lucrezia smiled, not the practiced court smile that had charmed and deceived for years, but something unpracticed, almost surprised. Alfonso took 3 steps forward and said simply, "You're not what I expected." The formal pleasantries should have followed. Instead, Lucrezia laughed and responded, "Neither are you." Within minutes, they were discussing subjects that would have horrified their protocol ministers. Alfonso described his canon designs. Lucrezia admitted her exhaustion with court ceremonies. He showed her his hands, scarred from forge work. She told him about surviving 2 husbands without ever having a real marriage. The meeting was supposed to last 1 hour. They talked for 3. This wasn't romantic fairy tale nonsense. These were 2 intelligent people recognizing unexpected compatibility. Alfonso's pragmatism matched Lucrezia's survival instincts. Her political sophistication complemented his military mind. When Alfonso mentioned the unusual consummation requirements, Lucrezia didn't blush or protest. She simply asked, "3 times?" When he nodded, she said, "Then we'd better like each other." Cardinal Ippolito d'Este, observing from the doorway, later wrote about his shock. He'd expected his brother to endure the meeting with characteristic stoicism. Instead, Alfonso was engaged, even animated. But here's what made this spark dangerous. It was mutual and unexpected. Both had entered that chamber prepared for duty, resigned to necessity. Neither had anticipated possibility. The dangerous thing about unexpected compatibility is how it complicates simple transactions. What should have been mechanical duty now carried the possibility of pleasure. What should have been political performance might become personal connection. As the meeting concluded, Alfonso did something uncharacteristic. He took Lucrezia's hand, not to kiss it formally, but to examine it. "Soft," he said, "but strong underneath, like good steel." She responded by touching one of his forged scars. "We all bear marks from our work." This spark would make their performance both easier and infinitely more dangerous. In just 2 days, this private passion would become the most public performance in Renaissance history. But what they didn't know was that the witness protocols had been designed not just to verify consummation, but to test whether human bodies could endure what no couple in history had been forced to attempt. Church bells rang across Ferrara for the Feast of the Purification of the Virgin as Lucrezia Borgia prepared to sacrifice her privacy on the altar of politics. February 2nd, 1502. The calculated irony wasn't lost on anyone. The Virgin Mary's holiest celebration would witness the most methodically planned deflowering in Renaissance memory. The morning began with purification rituals that bordered on parody. Lucrezia bathed in holy water mixed with rose petals while nuns sang hymns about virginal virtue. Never mind that she'd been married twice, borne at least 1 child, and survived enough scandal to damn a dozen women. Alfonso waited at the cathedral in functional armor, his choice sending a message. This was alliance forged in strength, not sentiment. When Lucrezia arrived, her dress answered his armor with its own defiance. White silk shot through with gold thread that caught light like weapon strikes. But here's what the wedding guest whispered about: the presence of 2 distinct groups of observers. First, the traditional witnesses, family members, church officials, diplomatic envoys. Behind them, almost hidden in cathedral shadows, stood a second group. Men with portable writing desks, physicians with medical training, legal experts versed in consummation law. Everyone knew these observers weren't here for the wedding. They were preparing for what would follow. The Mass became a study in contrast. Cardinal Ippolito d'Este presided, his Latin phrases carrying double meanings for those who listen closely. "Let this union be fruitful" meant heirs and territorial expansion. "May God bless this sacred bond" included the profane bonding scheduled for midnight. The most blasphemous moment came during the homily. The cardinal spoke of Mary's purity, of sacred vessels chosen for divine purpose. His gaze fixed on Lucrezia as he described how flesh could serve higher calling, how women's bodies became instruments of God's will. The subtext screamed louder than any sermon. Tonight, Lucrezia's body would serve the God of political necessity, and her sacrifice would be measured in witness penetrations. As midnight approached, the traditional bedding ceremony began, but this was no ordinary charivari. The witnesses assembled with documentary precision. Lucrezia's ladies undressed her, while observers noted her apparent health and lack of visible defects. Alfonso's men performed the same service, though he dismissed them quickly. The bed itself had been blessed 3 times, once for each planned consummation. 3 witnesses took their positions with the solemnity of executioners: a papal notary, a physician from the University of Bologna, and most unnervingly, Bernardino de Prosperi, Cardinal Ippolito's secretary and Isabella d'Este's personal spy. The protocol had been established with military precision. Witnesses would position themselves in an adjacent chamber, door slightly ajar, enough to hear, not necessarily see, though visual confirmation was authorized if necessary. Each man carried specific tools: sealed parchments, medical texts on consummation evidence, perfect memory for detailed reports. But here's what made this arrangement truly invasive. They weren't confirming a single act. The Borgia contract required sufficient proof of vigorous completion, deliberately ambiguous phrasing that meant multiple confirmations. Privacy wasn't just sacrificed, it was systematically destroyed. As the cathedral bells struck midnight, Lucrezia entered the bedchamber where Alfonso waited. Behind them, witnesses readied their quills. Ahead lay the most documented wedding night in history. The scratch of pens preparing parchment sounded like death rattles. But what those witnesses would document wasn't just 3 consummations, it was the birth of a new kind of political power. The heavy click of the bedchamber door locking echoed like a prison gate closing. 12:47 a.m., according to Francesco Castello's precise notation. Inside, Alfonso d'Este and Lucrezia Borgia faced each other across 3 feet of charged air, both understanding their next actions would be scrutinized, documented, and preserved in archives for centuries. Through the adjoining door, the witnesses listened with professional intensity. Bernardino de Prosperi noted the rustle of falling fabric, the soft gasp, whether surprise or pleasure, he couldn't determine. Dr. Ludovico Cari listened for sounds of distress that might indicate physical inability. Castello simply recorded, "The parties began their marital duties at 17 minutes before 1 a.m. But this wasn't the brutal claiming that wedding night horror stories often described. The witnesses noted surprising gentleness in the proceedings. Alfonso's voice, low but audible. "Tell me if—" Lucrezia's interruption, "I will." The sounds that followed required no interpretation, but what distinguished this from ordinary consummation was its calculated precision. Alfonso approached his bride like he approached his cannons, with respect for power that could destroy if mishandled. The physician made clinical notes about duration and vigor. The first coupling lasted approximately 20 minutes, respectable for establishing legitimacy. He noted the bride's vocal responses as indicating successful penetration and probable completion. But Prosperi's account provided more human detail. He described hearing Lucrezia whisper something that made Alfonso laugh, actually laugh during the act itself. After completion, they didn't immediately separate. Convention dictated quick withdrawal for witness confirmation, but the couple remained entwined. The critical moment came when Alfonso called out, "The first seal is set." Castello recorded the time, 1:23 a.m. Servants entered to change linens, carefully preserving stained sheets as physical evidence. Dr. Cari examined them with professional detachment, noting blood stains that suggested virginity, though everyone knew Lucrezia's ladies had prepared chicken blood for this purpose. But establishing legitimacy was only the beginning. As new sheets were arranged, as wine was brought to restore strength, the witnesses heard Alfonso say, "Once proves capacity, twice proves vigor, but your family's requirement—" Lucrezia's response was lost to history, but Prosperi noted she sounded determined rather than dismayed. The second consummation began at 2:15 a.m. This time, the sound suggested less mechanical precision. Whether growing comfort or genuine passion, building despite surveillance, none could determine. But fatigue crept into the performance. The witnesses heard Alfonso's breathing grow labored. Then Lucrezia's voice, soft but carrying, "We're halfway to freedom." The encouragement worked. Movement resumed with renewed determination. The bride was coaching her groom through their shared ordeal, partnership forged in the strangest circumstances. When completion finally came at 3:42 a.m., It was announced not with Alfonso's formal declaration, but with Lucrezia's exhausted laugh. The second seal is set, my lords. But even two wasn't enough. As the witnesses compared notes, they heard Alfonso's voice, rough with exhaustion. The Borgia Protocol demands three. The witnesses prepared for the final act. What they would document next would establish the template for European royal marriages for centuries. But it would cost Lucrezia more than anyone could foresee. Pre-dawn silence filled Ferrara as the ultimate test approached. How far could human bodies be pushed in service of political necessity? The answer would reshape the meaning of marriage itself. Pre-dawn exhaustion filled the chamber as the third trial approached. 4:30 a.m. Even the witnesses struggled against fatigue, but protocol demanded completion. Alfonso's voice carried desperation. I'm not sure I can. Lucrezia's response carried steel beneath silk. You can. We've come too far to fail now. Through the witness portal, Prosperi noted this reversal. The bride had become the strength, encouraging her flagging groom toward their mutual goal. The woman who'd survived two dead husbands wouldn't let a third fail through mere exhaustion. What the witnesses heard in that final approach was determination replacing passion. The sounds were different now, less rhythmic confidence, more desperate effort. Lucrezia's encouragements came constantly. Almost there. Stay with me for our future. The mechanical nature of this third act stripped away any remaining pretense. This was purely political now, two exhausted people pushing bodies past reasonable limits for dynastic necessity. But then something shifted. Perhaps it was approaching dawn, perhaps the knowledge this was their final trial. The witnesses heard laughter, not bitter or hysterical, but genuinely amused. Lucrezia said something about earning every ducat of that dowry. Alfonso responded with a comment about cannons requiring less careful aim. They were joking through their ordeal, finding absurdity in their situation. This gallows humor seemed to provide new energy. Dawn light crept through windows as the third act reached crescendo. 5:47 a.m. Costello noted the precise moment when Alfonso's voice, barely audible, announced, "The third seal is set." But it was Lucrezia who added, loud enough for witnesses to hear, "The Borgia promise is fulfilled. Let no one doubt este vigor or Borgia determination." The silence that followed was profound. Then breaking the spell came slow applause. Prosperi, overcome by the moment, was clapping. The other witnesses joined him. Bizarre recognition of superhuman effort in service of inhuman demands. 3 times. The number that would echo through European bedchambers for generations. But the true cost emerged 7 months later. September 5th, 1502. Lucrezia Borgia, who'd survived 3 husbands and countless poisoning attempts, nearly died bringing forth the child conceived during that triple consummation. The baby girl lived just long enough to be baptized before surrendering to whatever curse haunted Borgia wombs. As Lucrezia hemorrhaged in childbed, physicians whispered that her body was claiming payment for February's performance. For 2 weeks, she balanced between worlds. When she finally opened clear eyes on September 20th, her first words were, "Did the documentation arrive in Rome?" The physical toll was devastating. Lucrezia would suffer 4 more miscarriages over following years, her body never fully recovering from that brutal first pregnancy. But she'd achieved something unprecedented. She'd survived what should have destroyed her and emerged with new knowledge. If sexuality was currency, she would control the mint. The Borgia Protocol spread across Europe like plague. Within months, other noble families demanded witness triple consummations for their own alliances. What had been extraordinary became expectation. All because one night in Ferrara proved that bodies could be pushed to superhuman limits for political gain. Those careful witness notations, preserved in Vatican archives, waited 500 years before scholars could stomach their revelations. When finally unearthed in the 1990s, they revealed not the debauchery legend suggested, but something more disturbing: the systematic transformation of intimacy into bureaucracy. Today we're horrified by such invasion of privacy, such reduction of intimacy to political theater. But in our age of leaked videos and documented scandals, of performances for invisible audiences, and privacy sacrificed for power, perhaps we're not so different. Bodies remain battlefields. Bedrooms remain political. And somewhere in those Vatican vaults, Costello's careful notations wait, reminding us that power has always demanded its particular consummations. The witnesses thought they were documenting Borgia's submission and virility. Instead, they recorded the birth of sexual politics as formal discipline, where flesh became contract and performance became power. Every witness betting that followed across Europe traced back to that February dawn when three completions proved that if marriage was war by other means, then Lucrezia Borgia had just rewritten the rules of engagement forever.